All right, hi everyone. We're gonna get going. Let me do all of this. Hi everyone. Okay, first of all, so we can take a moment to talk about the glitter beard, and then we're gonna get into the podcast. I didn't want to shave today, so I put glitter all over my beard. Thank you, everyone. Let's get started.
But it's such a treat. I'm like mesmerized by it.
I was like, I hope Cheratomo is like into this. Like,
I'm very into it.
Perfect. Good. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to Myst Minutes. So this is a podcast about celebrating the passions and projects of those that are in content creation, in game dev, and in games research. For those that don't know me, my name is Sierra Myst. I'm a queer drag content creator here on Twitch, and I really like to talk to people about like what they've got going on. And so I'm really excited to be joined by Cheratomo, who is a team member of mine on Rainbow Arcade, but also does so many other things. And so I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, and then we're gonna dive into it. So welcome on in, everyone.
Hi, my name is Kara. I do go by Cheratomo online. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a narrative designer for a bunch of different video games and also a variety streamer on Twitch. I usually focus on like chill and cozy games and our inclusive space, and then I also play a lot of narrative-driven games that I like to analyze, and I do more analytical stuff of games on my Patreon and such.
That's awesome. I actually don't know a ton about your Patreon, so I actually want to start there, and I want you to tell me everything that's on your Patreon.
Well, I very recently revamped it because I realized that basically what I want to do is create video essays about narrative design in different games.
Okay.
And the videos that are up there right now are about Final Fantasy VII R and Persona 5 Royal, and I'm working on one for Final Fantasy VIII right now.
Yeah. And so do you approach those specifically from like the perspective of a narrative designer, or is there other kind of crit going on there that you're interested in?
It's primarily narrative design and talking about how the ways they tell the stories or frame their characters like influence the overall experience of the game and the gameplay within the game.
Okay, awesome. And so maybe like we should go actually back a step then. What is narrative design?
Well, narrative design is more than just writing for games. It essentially involves being in charge of the whole narrative for a game and trying to integrate it with the other aspects of the game outside of just like story and dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So you, depending on the project, you'll get some amount of creative influence over like the game mechanics, the audio, the graphics, different things like that. But it's about that integration of it as a cohesive whole.
Right. Okay. And so how do you get into something like that? Like, does that come from a writing background and then you kind of work your way into more like a niche, I guess, or...
So because it's still like relatively new, so like people can come from anywhere with this. Yeah. I have a degree in creative writing, and I have done a bunch of different kinds of writing before I got to games, mm-hmm. and then I transitioned into narrative design from being a writer for games after starting to make my own games and like being in charge of integrating the narrative in that way.
Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit more about like your own past work and everything. I'd love to hear what your journey up to this point has been. What have you worked on? What have you done?
As far as games go, I started off working for free for various like visual novels.
Sounds about right.
Eventually one of them encouraged me to charge for my services. Uh-huh. So it was in my final year of college, and I decided to like quit my job and basically only take one college class to try and get the writing thing off the ground.
Okay.
And luckily for me, I ended up getting a relatively high profile project, Asagao Academy Normal Boots Club, earlier on, and then I got to work with Moa Cube on the game Solstice, who they also made Cinders, if you're familiar with any kind of visual novels. That was like a big high profile one.
Yeah.
And then from there, it was kind of just a matter of networking, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And so I think I've worked on over 10 games at this point, not all of which made it to release.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That's a reality. So mostly it sounds like a lot of like, quote unquote, like indie projects, right? Like it's been a lot in that space. Yeah. And do you have like interest or aspirations towards like a AAA atmosphere? Or are you quite happy actually working on these smaller projects?
I have gotten offers to get involved with AAA projects. but generally I am more happy on the indie side of things. Um, there's a lot that goes into like the landscape of game dev and the jobs that are available and what they do and
Definitely.
mean for your future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess maybe like what was a highlight of kind of what's kind of the work that's maybe brought you the most like excitement?
For me right now, genuinely, the game that I just released, To Be With You,
Hmm.
is like probably the game that I've worked on that has been the most like fulfilling and meaningful to me.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a
Mhm.
little bit about like what that game is?
Yeah, so To Be With You is a semi-autobiographical visual novel that explores essentially unhealthy and abusive relationships.
Hmm.
Um, and it was really meaningful to me because I had the idea for it for about 5 years, and I hadn't had the funding to push it through until Playcrafting contacted me, and as part of their initiative to help fund Black creators,
Hmm.
they gave me some money in order to help push it out the door.
Great.
Um, yeah, but I've always wanted to try and like I went through an abusive relationship when I was younger, and I wanted to try and give people a safe method for understanding what the experience of being in an abusive relationship is like, and then to
Hmm.
be able to explain to them like how mechanically it happened and what you can look out for to avoid it yourself.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And so I guess obviously that must have been a very like personal experience for you. Probably one that was very difficult. How do you decide to kind of, for lack of a better word, expose yourself that way in a game? How was that experience for you?
It was terrifying, I'm not gonna lie.
Hmm.
The I worked on it for it was only a month-long game jam, so I worked on it for a month, and that month was one of the most stressful months of my entire life.
Yeah.
Um, especially because like there's always like that 1% chance that you release it and it catches the attention of the wrong crowd, and then you have people coming after you. And I basically like lay out bare all of my most negative experiences in terms of like abusive relationships, and I provide fodder
Yeah.
essentially. So I was very scared, and then it was also just very emotionally draining to have to go back and revisit those memories to such an extent in order to like capture them
Hmm.
properly for the
Yeah.
game.
Because when we think about creative work and we think about game dev, without putting our personal experiences into that, that's already work that's quite draining itself, right? So you really decided to just stack some draining work on top of some already draining work.
Yeah, but I felt so strongly. Like I was like,
Hmm.
I want to help people. I like if putting out this game means that I could possibly prevent one person from going through the experience that I had to go through,
Hmm.
then I was like willing to do anything in order to get it out there.
Yeah. So what has been kind of the response? I know you released it on just itch.io, I believe. Is it anywhere else?
It's just on itch.io, but it's going to be out on Steam within the next month or so.
Okay, great. And what's been the
Mhm.
response so far?
So far it's been really positive. It's hard to say positive with a game like this.
Yeah.
Um, People tend to be really emotionally impacted by it, and I've had a lot of abuse survivors actually play the game and talk to me about how useful it was to be able to see things in that they could point to and be like, my abuser did that too, and
Yeah.
like to understand how it worked and to see somebody else's emotional response to it and realize that like their feelings in that moment were valid and also probably the most reasonable feelings to have. Like you
Hmm.
get told a lot that you're overreacting, or you get gaslit to heck and back.
Yeah.
um so it helped a lot of abuse survivors actually like contextualize the
Hmm.
things that happened to them and like be like, yeah, that was bad behavior and I can point to it now and I know what it is.
Yeah, so I played the game myself, and I also went through a somewhat similar situation actually quite a few years ago, and so I can definitely relate to that experience of being able to read these. It almost seems like something out of a journal that I would have wrote at that time, like the description of what some events were. Is obviously very impactful, and then to see different ways of also resolving these situations and different choices given, and going through those feelings of like, this isn't what I did though, was a very interesting experience. Or that's interesting how that worked out, because that's not how it worked out for me, right? I think it's an interesting therapeutic exercise. All that to say, I greatly enjoyed it.
Oh, great!
Yeah, if it, although it was very uncomfortable due to the personal nature of it, which I think is how it's designed, right?
Yeah, it's meant to be very uncomfortable and borderline horrific. I really wanted people who hadn't been through that experience to fully empathize with it, because I think a lack of empathy for victims is one of the key issues around why not a lot gets done, like societally, to resolve these patterns of behavior we see.
Absolutely. And so I know you also included a, like, I believe, a director's commentary. Is that how it was worded? Yeah. So I would love to. I didn't play through that, so I would actually love to hear kind of what went into that work and what that looks like. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So after you beat the game your first time around, if you start up the game a second time, there's a director's commentary. And how that happens is basically there are certain lines or words that will be underlined, and when you hover over them, you will get like my thoughts on what's going on. And through that director's commentary, that's where I do most of the teaching. Like, I call out the tactics that are being used by name. I explain like what the motivation is behind the tactics. I explain the different possible reactions people can have to those tactics. And I really try to like teach and inform. I also give background information on like the characters and my own experiences and stuff like that. But primarily, I wanted to like lay out how exactly this all happened.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so when I think about kind of those like teachable moments, I think obviously you're a survivor of that relationship, and you've done your own work since then, and your own education around that. Did you do extra research going into that project, or was this knowledge that you learned in those situations that you then put into this game?
This was definitely knowledge that I've learned. It was primarily about an abusive relationship, but I've experienced abuse for a very large portion of my life, and then spent like several solid years like learning about it and trying to inform myself so that I could understand it better. What happened to me. And so it is very well researched, but most of that research was done over the course of like 7 years and with multiple therapists.
Right, exactly. And so, yes, it's you word it as a semi-autobiographical game, right? So I guess I would like to also hear like what goes into the decisions of whether what makes it the semi part, right? And what goes into those decisions when you're making a game about your own experience?
Well, I didn't want this to be a game where I was like directly trying to call out my abuser from like, at this point, like almost 10 years ago, and like try to drag him through the mud. I didn't want anything to be identifiable. And I also did not like the idea of directly putting out my actual experiences of abuse and just like letting people walk through them. Like, I thought I thought that was a bad, like, just directly laying out my own experience wouldn't be a great way to understand how abuse works. And it also wouldn't allow me to like design the game in order to make people feel kind of as uncomfortable as possible. So everything that's in the game has a root somewhere in my actual experience. It's either a situation that happened that's been like transported into a different context, or the feelings are there. There's lots of things that are like almost one-to-one, except for like the scenario are very different. Like the conversation with Michelle in like the 7th scene where you're at the party and your boyfriend, your abusive boyfriend is basically outing to you subtly that he's cheating on you, but like is also trying to gaslight you about it and pretend that that's not what's going on for his own amusement.
Right. Yeah.
That is something that I did definitely very directly experience. And it was like one of the worst feelings I've ever experienced. And that's why I wanted to put it into the game.
There's some things that are just core to what this is about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so kind of switching to like what the actual kind of like technical back end is kind of to this, what goes into creating a game like this? So, you know, if this wasn't obviously it was very draining due to the nature of it. But let's say it wasn't it wasn't that kind of game. How did you get into kind of, you know, this? I don't think every narrative designer also makes their own games.
That's true.
Yeah.
I have, so like this goes into my philosophy about games in general, but I really firmly believe that games can be utilized as like lived experiences to help teach people how to empathize with others.
Mm-hmm.
And like I feel very strongly about games as interactive fiction that allows you to experience things more directly than other forms of fiction would.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows you to like grow as a person more directly because you're
Yeah.
able to interact with the game.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of my narrative design work comes down from that. And so I make my own games because there's different experiences I want to put out into the world for people to have
Mm-hmm.
towards that development. It's definitely not because they're going to make money.
Sure.
Because they don't really. Yeah. But I want to like push games in this direction of becoming more of an art form, I guess, and becoming more about like expanding who we are as people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the design decisions come from that as well, where I basically, it's kind of hard to explain, but all of the mechanics of the game are designed to provide you with an emotional experience that then the story is meant to contextualize, and like it's meant to be very emotionally impactful, so that like at times you'll have to like stop and think about what exactly just happened and
Mm-hmm.
how you're feeling about it.
Right. And so what are some good examples of games that you didn't work on that kind of do this kind of like games for good, right? Like where do you draw your inspiration from in games, if anywhere at all?
There's a lot of good games. Hang on. A normal lost phone is one that people like usually are pretty familiar with, and that does this. It's a very short game that, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it
You can give a
contextualizes an experience
intro
for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, the concept of a normal lost phone is that you pick up a phone on the ground that has been lost, and you're trying to like go back through the information on the phone to find out who owns the phone and how you can get the phone back to them, and whether you should get the phone back to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extremely great game that I encourage you to play, because it's like this peek into somebody else's inner life by going through something as personal as their own phone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you made this game, did you have this kind of like are these, because you did it in a 1-month game jam, were these experiences that you, or I guess were these skills that you already had going into this, or were you game jamming? Were you learning skills on the fly? And
I would say that this is skills that I already had, and I had been like, this had been brewing quietly in my mind for over the course of 5 actual years.
Yeah.
So like, although I didn't have any idea how I was going to turn it into the game, I think that it's just been in the back of my mind for so long that once I made the decision to make it a game, it just kind of came out full-fledged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I guess what do you want to do next? Do you have like a project that you're thinking about next?
I have personal projects that I'm thinking about. I actually want to now like take a break on games and work on a novel that I've been working on for a couple of years. But I'm chronically ill, and so right now I am lucky enough to be getting a lot of game work. And so that's kind of taking time out from working on my own stuff.
Yeah.
But eventually you will see a book from me.
Fantastic. And then so kind of thinking about, I guess, like what else are you working on right now? Like, is there anything that you can talk about? Is there anything that's been piquing your interest right now?
Yeah, there's one game that I can talk about. It's called Onsen Master.
Mm-hmm.
and it's one that I'm a narrative designer on. I was brought in like relatively late into the project, but it's kind of Overcooked meets Studio Ghibli.
Mm.
Um,
Oh.
and it's a very family friendly game. Yeah.
That sounds so cute.
Yeah, it's gonna be out like sometime this year, sometime in the first half of this year. So, but it's designing the narrative for that was really fun because I've never actually written specifically for children before.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and it was really interesting. Like, I basically styled it like a monster of the week anime story that
Okay.
also talks about important themes.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah, and it was really fun to try and figure out a way to make things interesting to kids still,
Right.
while still carrying like a lot of meaning, but being like
Yeah.
vibrant and big and fun for for children, so they don't get distracted.
Okay. That's fantastic. I love that.
Mhm.
And then we talked a little bit about this before we started, but I believe you have something else that kind of is
Right.
coming up.
I like forgot. Yeah. So I did a writing workshop for the Global Game Jam, and the Global Game Jam is currently online. So if you're game dev and you're interested in just learning more about, or if you're just a fan and you're interested in learning more about how games are made and how people think creatively about games, there's a bunch of talks and workshops that are going on. But I did one specifically about writing and like building on your writing skills, not just for games, but in general.
Mhm.
And I believe that one airs this Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time.
Okay. And so what goes into like creating like a workshop or something like that? Because I think, knowledge sharing like within these industries is quite important. So what was key to you to kind of get across?
Well, this was my first time doing a workshop,
Uh-huh.
but what I wanted to communicate was basically the skills that I found the most useful over the course of my career. I think I've been writing professionally for like either 8 or 9 years
Mhm.
now, and so I've had like a whole a whole journey. Like I wasn't that great at the beginning, um, but I like supply certain frameworks about how to think about writing and how to think about developing your skills and like how to how do I put this? I kind of gamify it a little bit, I guess. I kind
Mhm.
of more gamify it so that it's easier for you to focus on different skills and then work on building them. And I provide exercises for that as well.
Love that. Yeah, absolutely. Because workshops are quite an in-person activity usually. So
Yeah,
with a,
usually. So instead, it's like a lecture with exercises at the end.
yeah. Well, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. I guess kind of like what is in the industry itself, I guess, what are you interested right now in narrative design? You talked a little bit about kind of like this games for good move, right? About
Mhm.
trying to create these experiences for people to feel empathy or to experience something that they might not normally. What else is kind of draws you into like the industry right now?
Right now, I'm really interested in seeing more own voices content.
Hmm.
So seeing more representation in games has like basically gotten better over time,
Hmm.
but at the same time there's a lot of games. Yeah, I'm like basically we used to have a period of time where you could only play as like a straight white guy, so
Sure. Yeah.
it's come since then, but
Yeah.
there's still a lot of like, I guess, we're going to put this character in here and like paint them a certain color or tell you that they're a certain way, and like that's as far as we're going to incorporate that aspect of their identity into the character or the game.
Yeah.
Like we're having this representation which I think is still meaningful, especially after so long of having literally none.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of characters that don't feel like they're actually representing what they're supposed to be representing. Like I look at
Hmm.
them and I'm like, I don't see any experiences. Like I don't see anything coming out in your behavior or the way you think or like what your story is about that reflects my experiences as a person of color or as a queer
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm very interested in like supporting really, really indie developers who are
Mhm.
about own voices, who are about like sharing their experiences in
Yeah.
work.
And do you think that mostly comes from kind of like independent projects similar to like your own, or are these things that you think a whole, can a team do this? Like how, like what does that look like for the larger industry, right?
A team can definitely do this, but so basically, when it comes to indie studios, every studio slash team is like so different about how
Yes.
they do literally everything,
Yeah,
from like
absolutely.
even just like project management, and like whether you're allowed to talk to the other members on the team,
Hmm.
or whether you're allowed to have any input with anybody else on the team,
Yeah.
is a big question. So there are like lots of indie studios that have like marginalized people on their team, but don't necessarily give them as much input as I personally would want to see
Hmm.
in the final product.
Hmm.
And so we're seeing more studios come out with people heading the project who are marginalized and want to make their own voices content,
Yeah.
instead of games headed by maybe somebody who isn't marginalized, who wants to have diversity on their team, but then who doesn't really know how to incorporate that into making a marketable diverse game.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
And
marketable
so,
usually being the issue.
yeah. But like I think we're increasingly seeing that that's not the case when we see games succeed that don't have this typical, archetype of a character, right? Um when I think about kind of diversity and inclusion, often it's always underscored by a conversation about profit and marketability, right? Which isn't always actually, useful. And so when I hear you talk about kind of, you see representation in games but not always, it doesn't have the depth, right? To
Yeah.
me that reads as representation that doesn't actually tackle the structural issues of what's going on, which is really kind of where we can see change. Diversity and inclusion can get people in the door, by quotas for women on your boards of directors, or having the existence of a diversity committee and these kinds of things. Sure, that gets people in the door, but then how are they actually able to affect change at like a structural level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you, other than kind of like what you've talked about, where we see the support and the success of these projects that are about kind of these lived experiences of people, how do we see that in the larger industry? I know you've talked about how you've gotten offers at AAA industries, but they haven't been of interest to you. Is this part of that? Is this a conversation?
Yeah. It's a whole conversation. So
Hmm.
um just to make sure we're talking about like why maybe the diversity hasn't come out, even though companies are like ostensibly trying to include diversity.
A little bit, yeah. I guess I'm kind of looking for your perspective on like what's wrong. What's wrong?
Well, where do I get started?
Yeah.
So like my perspective on like why the games industry is like this is basically because in the beginning foundational aspect of the games industry, we had a lot of straight white guys who were starting to make games, and that was because they were generally the people who had access to technology way back in the day when it was like super expensive.
Yeah.
um, and so what we've seen is those people who eventually make a lot of success and get big and found studios, they just hire their friends
Yeah.
and they hire more and more of their friends. And like games has a in my opinion, has a huge problem with just wanting to hire people that you already know and not
Hmm.
being willing to take a chance on new up and comers.
Hmm.
And that's already like a big issue in terms of who has access to the technology to play games, to explore them, to code. Uh, that's a financial issue that not everybody has access to.
Hmm.
And then it comes to an issue of retention in the industry, especially in the AAA space, where first of all most game devs are laid off after a big game is released anyways. But then a lot of times you can be hired as a minority and expected to offer your contributions, but those companies don't make it safe for you to offer those contributions. And you doing that like disgruntles your colleagues, it
Mhm.
makes the management upset,
Yeah.
and yet it's still a burden that is placed on you.
Mhm.
And if something goes wrong in the game, you're the one who's blamed because, well, we have people like that. I don't know why he didn't tell us that this was a
Yeah.
problem to include. Um, so and just generally speaking, the games industry is kind of a lot like the acting industry, where it's not friendly to developers. It seeks
Mhm.
more to exploit than it does to like invest in and help you up. And so
Mhm.
that's been a lot of why I've not been interested in AAA development. My
Right.
offers have come from studios that have a known track record of treating their diverse employees poorly, or like really intense crunch that I know I wouldn't be able to do because of like my chronic illnesses.
Yeah.
So barriers to entry.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's kind of I think that's a conversation that's happening more and more about like what's going on in the industry, and so hopefully we can see some change there, unionization, all that stuff that would be fantastic for the people actually working in the industry.
Just like space off.
Yeah.
I would love to see that, but to be honest, I don't necessarily expect change to come from the top down,
Yeah.
because the way just all of the finances about the games industry work,
Yeah.
it's gonna be something where the gears and like devs who join unions get fired.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
gonna have to be something where maybe it's pushed from the underground, or like
Hmm.
there's financial pressure for them to change the way that it's currently going, because it is ultimately very destructive. But if they can make a profit, they'll keep doing it, which is
Yeah.
why I think most people want to go indie
Yeah.
in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I've talked to a lot of developers, and often they've started their own studio because they left a AAA studio, and they were unhappy with various working conditions or various this and that, right? And so it seems
Mhm.
to be quite a consistent theme. But we went off on a little
Yeah.
bit of a tangent. This is supposed to be about talking about your passions and your projects. Although
Oh.
I definitely think obviously these things are passions for you. But
Yes.
maybe we can think about like I guess what what is something that you would like to do going forward? What's like a project that, you know, obviously we've talked about that you've got a lot going on, you have some novels and these kinds of things. But what's something that you think is like neat that you want to try sometime? What like excites you when you see someone else doing this in narrative design or in game dev?
So this is like super far out
Yeah,
there. I have no
shoot
idea
high,
when
shoot
this will
high.
happen. I would love to design like a whole interactive experience that is like within a building. Like I want to
Okay.
imagineer a game experience
Uh-huh.
inside of a building
Yeah.
that is like primarily narrative, and that you're able to, again, get as close to living the experience as possible without, hopefully without traumatizing
Right.
anybody. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about escape rooms then. What do you think about escape rooms? Do you want to make an escape
I've
room?
I've never done an escape room, but I really, really, yes, I would love to make an escape room. I love
Uh-huh.
puzzles. I love like theming. I love designing experiences for people.
Hmm.
And like I think I inherited this from my grandmother. I think my grandma always said that if you want to make something feel special, then you need to treat it differently than you do like the rest of your everyday life.
I love
So I
that.
want to
Yeah.
like make these experiences for people that are just intensely like something that they'll never forget. So
Hmm.
whether it brings them a lot of joy or a lot of fun or it makes them think, I want to
Yeah.
like give people these magical moments in their lives.
Yeah.
That's what I would love to do.
I love that. So can we expect then kind of in the future is there the Cheratomo escape room company of designing escape room experiences, but maybe not the typical escape rooms of like you're locked in a prison or something like that. But
Yeah.
do you want to push escape rooms, or maybe I should stop using the term escape room? Do you want to push what these immersive play experiences can look like?
I I would very much like to, although I think that it's going to be pretty difficult getting into that just because of like the
Uh-huh.
financial situations
Of
involved.
course,
But
yeah.
yeah, but I would love to like maybe partner with an escape room company and like
Mhm.
try and see if they're willing to experiment with a new format and
Yeah,
see if it can be financially viable for them to maybe expand from there.
absolutely. Um, and then I think about this is a bit of a tangent, so sorry. But
It's fine.
um, my partner works as a standardized patient, and so he's an actor, but he works as a standardized patient to work with medical students who are in their training, to basically go through experiences with difficult families, difficult patient situations, experiences of like how do you communicate the administration of a hospital to a sick person, right?
Hmm.
Is that an area of interest that, like when we think about narrative design, obviously our first thought is games, but there's a lot of things that have narratives that are not games, right? So you seem very
Yes.
excited, so I would love to hear your perspective about this.
I actually there was a period of time where I considered trying to do that as a job
Uh-huh.
as well. I was too sick by then to be able to do it, but
Mhm.
yeah, I in my past I also have experience as like actress and
Mhm.
a stage director and a script writer. So I feel very yes, I think like basically anything that comes forth as an experience is a thing that I get really passionate about, and
Mhm.
including acting. I was very interested in experimental theater in my
Mhm.
youth,
Mhm.
which not most people are not familiar with it, but experimental theater is a way of using theater to again create unique experiences that don't necessarily always involve a straightforward narrative.
Mhm.
Like especially like there's forms of like Dadaist theater that are just there's there's a legend of a Dadaist actor who like got on stage to perform and sat down and pulled open a newspaper and read the newspaper for the entire performance. uh there's a bunch of different like interesting ways that I just think that we're all a little bit trapped by traditional narrative structures. That's all I'm
Uh-huh.
trying to say.
Okay,
I
okay.
think we're all a little trapped.
Sure. So can we expect the next Cheratomo project to be about like just reading a newspaper in like a game or something like that? Like is that the direction that we're going?
No, that probably not anything as much as I admire the Dadaists, I also don't like
Right.
I don't like them. Yeah, I'm like I wouldn't go to a Dadaist performance myself. It's really fun to perform, but not for me to watch
Sure.
anyways. Um yeah, but I definitely I think that my games going forward are going to be more about exploiting those experiences. If I find the main issue for me with games is that I want to be able to pay people appropriately for working on my projects.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
projects I work on, generally speaking, aren't gonna make money.
Yeah.
um, so so for me, it's mostly a matter of funding. There's a lot like especially if I could get into VR,
Hmm.
there's a lot that I would like to do there, but
Yeah.
that comes with a lot of extra work and money that currently I don't know how to do, and
Hmm.
I would need to figure out a way to finagle that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think about even things like, VR chat, right? Which are not one thing. But people are creating a lot of different experiences in there, just in terms of like environments and putting up signs that explain things, which I
Hmm.
think is like a really interesting space. When we were talking about kind of the history of the game industry before, there was this democratization of it, right? When all of a sudden anyone can make a game if you
Hmm.
downloaded these various like game makers and had access to these programs. Then you have to have the access to the time and the resources and the energy and all those sorts of things. But there was a little bit of a democratization for it. And I'm wondering if, in the same way that VR was kind of this black box for development for so long, if, things like VR chat can provide that same potential avenue for people who want to explore those spaces for development of experiences.
I think we're definitely heading in that direction. Like a lot of, we're seeing more and more affordable, even like VR headsets just for the
Yeah.
experience of VR to become mainstream. And we're
Yeah.
also starting to see more affordable, like graphics cards that are capable of running VR, like the
Yeah.
3070 that came out.
Yeah.
It's only $500, but you can do VR from it. Um, So I think that like in a couple of years, we're going to start seeing a lot coming through the pipeline, and we're going to start seeing that become more accessible for people,
Hmm.
for sure.
Fantastic. And obviously that's something that you're very excited about.
Yeah, I basically basically expect to see me with my hands in like 10 different pies,
Uh-huh.
because
Yeah.
if there's an experience to explore, I will try to design
Designing
it.
VR chat experiences, writing a novel, working on escape rooms. It seems like there's going to be a
Streaming.
yeah, it's streaming. Yeah, I mean, we haven't even talked about that.
Yeah, as
Yeah, you're
interactive
yeah.
experience.
I've heard you do a little bit of the content creation sometimes. Would
Maybe
you?
just a wee bit.
Yeah, you dabble. So where did that come from, and how does that fit in with your identity as a narrative designer?
Um, so it honestly it fits in more with my identity and my past of being an actress.
Hmm.
I really wanted to pursue acting as a kid and as an adult, but once I actually started getting jobs, I realized that the lifestyle that accompanied acting wasn't a lifestyle that like I wanted to live, to
Hmm.
immerse myself in.
Right.
So I moved away from that. And streaming is a way to perform more directly and like with live interaction in a way that
Hmm.
you don't normally get from most other forms of performance, save maybe theater performance.
Hmm.
And even then it's not as direct interaction.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously streaming allows me to talk about narrative design and just talk my
Yes.
head off about how games are made and like what how the writing works and how I think that affects the course of the overall experience as we play.
Hmm. Now, we talked a little bit about this before we started the podcast, but I used to kind of like turn off my academic interviewee brain. But when I was streaming, is this kind of like a similar journey or experience that you've gone on yourself with your content creation?
Yeah, it actually, I made the decision in kind of August of 2020 to move more and like bring more of my narrative design aspect into it. The more I lean into that, the more people tell me that they actually just really like to hear me go off on like deep immersive tangents
Hmm.
about very specifically niche things.
Yeah.
Um, so and that's what I love to do. That's what gets me excited. So that's part of why I revamped the Patreon and everything like that. I
Hmm.
would like to focus more on how I can uniquely contribute by providing that perspective and like
Hmm.
helping people understand some of the work that goes into the games that they love and understand how they get the feelings that they get from the games because of how the narrative is structured.
Hmm. Yeah. I think this is a similar experience with a lot of other uh, streamers in that I think we all go into it thinking that it's one thing, but it turns out people just want to hear us yell about what we're knowledgeable about yelling about.
Yeah, as
Yeah.
it turns out.
Yeah, as it turns out. So is there anything else that you wanna talk about? We've covered a lot of different areas, but what else is exciting to you? Do you have anything else you want to plug?
I wasn't prepared. Um, no, the thing that's exciting me the most right now is just exploring like long form analyses of narratives
Hmm.
through my Patreon. But
Yeah.
um, I've never like you know like the Lindsay Ellis's and the Jenny Nicholsons of the world who do really long video essays about things.
Yes.
I've never considered myself capable of doing
Hmm.
such things.
Hmm.
But now that I'm trying, I'm finding that it's really fun and there's a lot to talk about, and I can get into really in-depth detail and like provide examples so that people know specifically what I am talking about.
Yeah.
Uh, very intensely. So I've just been having a lot of fun exploring that mode of sharing my thoughts.
That's fantastic. That's great. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me for the Myst Minutes. I think this was a fantastic conversation. Would you please outro yourself and please tell us about where we can find your Patreon, where we can find your game, how we can support you. Like, please plug everything.
Okay.
Do the whole damn thing.
The good news is that I have the same username on every platform. So, Cheratomo, Cheratomo. You can find me on Twitch Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays at 3 p.m. PT. You can find my Patreon at Cheratomo. I'm on Twitter. I'm on TikTok. um, and you can find all of my game and game related work at illusseed.com. That's ILLUSSEED.com. And there are links to all of the games that I've ever been involved with. So if you're interested in any of them, you can go check them out. I would especially recommend Solstice probably to this audience if you like murder mystery games and if you like queer representation.
Ooh, fantastic. That was a very effective plug, I think.
Hey!
You know who you're talking to.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, once again, I want to thank you so much for participating. Thank you, everyone who's listening right now, either live or listening to it later. Again, I've been Sierra Myst. You can find me everywhere at Sierra X Myst. And Myst Minutes is a podcast devoted to the passions and projects of game creators, games researchers, and content creators. This podcast will be up on all the podcast platforms over the weekend. And look forward to our next month of guests, which I have not announced yet. But this concludes the first month of this podcast, actually, which is very exciting for me. I really found a lot of joy in this project. And I hope you all have found a lot of joy in hearing me dive into what they're doing. So once again, thank you all so much. And we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get back to the usual Sierra X Myst gameplay stuff. So everyone say goodbye to Kara.
Bye. Thank you so much for having me.
Yay.